Good evening. I'm Ellen Hayes, and I'm the chair of the Sister Rose Thiering Fund. So pleased to have you here tonight for Legacy Day and talk about Sister Rose's legacy. I remember an evening in this very room where Orrin Jacoby had first come down to talk to Rose about the project. I sat out in the hall the whole evening because that's where I was assigned to sit. And so I missed what was going on inside, but Ken Aleka and his wife came out and informed me of what had happened. And it was great to hear that. And so I have very warm memories of this room, and particularly as they relate to Sister Rose. So we welcome you, and I hope you'll enjoy the speaker tonight. I've already spoken to him, and I enjoyed it, so there we go. Thank you.
They can't hear you.
Oh.
A little bit more, please.
I'm going to swallow it there.
I know, my apologies.
So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our program, our executive director of the Sister Rose Thiering Fund, who is also an associate professor of religion in the Department of Religion here at Seton Hall, and is indispensable to our mission, and that is Dr. Anthony Siglitano.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Ellen is our amazing new chair this year, and we're just incredibly grateful for all her work and efforts. And welcome everyone to this celebration of Sister Rose's legacy, borne out most directly and forcefully by our board members here tonight, who continue to bring her mission into the present ever since the fund's beginnings in 1993. These generous and devoted members of our board support Sister Rose's mission to educate and help form young people to be upstanders against anti-Semitism, injustice, and bigotry more broadly. She put it this way: I know the power of teachers. It is my deepest wish that teachers in our public and parochial schools, with scholarship assistance, will be able to enroll in Jewish Christian studies at Seton Hall University to stem the tide of ignorance in our schools and in society. Our board and the many friends of our mission support scholarships to our Jewish Christian Studies program, master's program, begun at Sister Seton Hall by Monsignor Osterreicher. I want to begin then by recognizing the work our board members do financially, but also through their dedicated service throughout each year in many and varied ways. From serving on our board to public speaking, to outreach, to connecting the Sister Rose Thiering Fund and the graduate program of Jewish Christian Studies to a variety of people and organizations. Without their dedication, these scholarships and events would quickly become impossible. I also want to say that the mission of the Sister Rose Thiering Fund stands at the heart of Seton Hall's own mission. A crucial and historic element of the Catholic mission of Seton Hall has to do with the church's relation with a variety of religious traditions. And we're very happy to have a number of people here tonight, but one group is the Archdiocese of Newark Commission on Interreligious Affairs and also ecumenical dialogue. Over here, Father Phil is the head of the commission, and Father Luke is there. Okay, yes, the head of the two commissions. So really happy to have them with us at these events. It's fantastic. The central Catholic document on issues of interreligious relations is Nostra Aetate, which many of you will know, a document that has deep roots in Seton Hall itself, with Monsignor Osterreicher's enormous contribution at the Second Vatican Council, where he also brought Sister Rose's dissertation to the attention of Cardinal Bea. This document set a new course for Catholic relations with many religious traditions, but most significantly, the Church's relations with the Jewish people. Monsignor Osterreicher, of course, is the founder of the Institute for Judeo-Christian Studies at Seton Hall, and also the graduate program in Jewish Christian Studies. He brought Sister Rose to Seton Hall in 1968. If interreligious dialogue is central to Catholic mission in our age, and the Catholic University is, in the words of St. John Paul II, where the Church does its thinking, then certainly the work of the Sister Rose Thering Fund and the graduate program in Jewish Christian Studies lie at the heart of Seton Hall's mission. It is a pleasure and honor to serve the board and to serve Sister Rose's mission. Our students past and present owe you a great debt of gratitude. I would like now to turn your attention to Ms. Ellen Hayes, not only current chair of the board, but also a former teacher scholar in the graduate program herself. Ellen started teaching in 1968 and has had a wealth of experience in a diversity of fields. She's been a guidance counselor, worked in employment training and geriatrics with pregnant and parenting teenagers, and in alternative education. She's taught in public education in 5 different states, teaching English, math, social studies, psychology, art, and science. She spent the last 27 years at Milburn High School as an English teacher, from which she will probably gratefully retire graciously and gratefully perhaps retire in June. So I give you Ms. Ellen Hayes.
I forgot to write that, put down for Tony that I also worked in 3 prisons, which was some of my favorite jobs. Some of my favorite jobs were working in prisons. Okay. I also did that. I'm a teacher. And as a teacher, I look at the world with great hope. And many years ago, I saw an ad in the newspaper. It was in the Star Ledger, big time back then, advertising was going on. And I took the ad and I put it in a pile next to my wing chair that was meant to be dealt with later on in the summer. And at the end of the summer, I cleaned it out, and at the bottom of the pile was this ad. And I thought, it's probably too late to apply. I was really interested. But I thought, no, it's too late. So I just moved it over and put it on the other side, which was the discard pile. And I swear, right-handed, a voice said to me, do it and do it now. There was no one else in the room. And that voice wasn't from the outside, it was from the inside. And I've heard that voice many times in my life. So make of it what you will, but I obey that voice, because it's always paid off and been good news. And so I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, have that same voice. Listen to it, it's good stuff. So I did, and I applied for the program. I called Marilyn Zerlin and I said, well, you gotta get it in fast, gotta get it in fast. And I said, I'll get it in fast, I promise you. And I did, and I started that fall. And I can only tell you that it changed my life. It transformed it. It made me empowered, certainly more knowledgeable than I'd ever been in any and all of these jobs. And it allowed me to do things in my classroom that I couldn't have done otherwise. You would be amazed at the questions that come up in British literature about religion, or maybe you wouldn't. I know Father Frizzell wouldn't, because I have a book that I got from Father Frizzell about the Bible in British literature, which I use all the time. So the program for me was one in which I met a lot of people who weren't necessarily like me, which I love. That's what I'm all about. Who certainly didn't have the same religious backgrounds as I did. Not too many Episcopalians at all. So, and I remember in one class in particular, Deborah, I don't think you were in this one, although you may have been. Lewis was in it. And it was one of Dr. Bossman's class, and it was Jewish Christian confrontation. What is it? Encounter, confrontation, sorry about that. Encounter. And it was in the evening, it was in Jubilee Hall at that time, and we were talking in there. I don't even remember what we were talking about. And I remember looking around the room and looking at everybody, and we'd been there for a while in the class, so we knew each other pretty well. And I also knew people from the class because I took other courses with them. And I said to myself, I would not want to be anyplace else in the world right now other than right here. I love these people. I love what I'm doing. I love what I'm learning. I love Dr. Bossman. And I said to myself, you're going to remember this for a long time. And I have. It was a beautiful moment. Everyone I've ever talked to, including some of the new people who are currently even in the program, have that same kind of reaction. There is something absolutely wonderful here that's uplifting, that carries you through any given day. I have a wonderful job. I've been doing this since 1968, and I love my job, which isn't a job. I get to look at the future every day, and let me tell you, it is looking so. You've heard me say this. It's looking so good. I tell my kids every day that they are the future, and they have the responsibility to carry on. It's not so much that we can leave the world the way we want it. We have done our best. I'm a child of the 60s. Heaven only knows we tried. But we need to empower them so that what they inherit, what the legacy, if you will, that they inherit is one that they can push forward. It's not just one generation that's going to be able to do it. It's going to, unfortunately, take many. But I am ever hopeful and always hopeful, and so proud to be able to say I was here in the program. And thank you so much to all of you who have contributed to it. It means the world. It really does. And it does truly change lives. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a better teacher. Thank you.
I just want to thank Yolanda. Maybe you could stand real quick. I know it's annoying to make people do that, but Yolanda really is responsible for setting all this up and really keeping us organized and just being a wonderful person to work with, frankly. So this evening, and thank you may be the right word. So this evening we're grateful to have Rabbi Ron Kronish with us. I had the pleasure of dining with him tonight, and I think you'll just really enjoy his company for the next while. Consistent with the legacy of Sister Rose, Rabbi Ron has led a life devoted to building peace and to teaching. Rabbi Kronish is the founding director of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, a position he held from 1992 to 2016. And I love the commitment that range of years suggests. Prior to founding the ICCI, Rabbi Kronish served as director of the Office of American Jewish Organization in Israel, director of staff development, and later co-director for the Melit Centers for Jewish Zionist Education. With his doctorate in the philosophy and history of education from Harvard, Rabbi Kronish has been in high demand as a lecturer from Tel Aviv University to Hebrew University of Jerusalem to a variety of interreligious groups in the United States and internationally, including the Far East. He's also taught at a university located somewhere in Madison, New Jersey, where he drew a good number of students to his seminars, and he has taught at his alma mater, Brandeis University, as well. Rabbi Kronish is the editor of 4 books of essays and has authored his own monograph, The Other Peace Process, Interreligious Dialogue, A View from Jerusalem, in 2017, used today in many classrooms. Rabbi Kronish has lived in Israel for the past 41 years with his wife Amy, and we are thrilled to have him with us this evening to tell us about his new book, Profiles in Peace, Voices of Peace Builders in the midst of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which you can find right outside the back door, is available to you for a special price. Okay. Rabbi Kronish, we're so happy to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you. Don't get nervous when the speaker, takes off his watch. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. This good? Ooh. That's better? Oh, got me in the back. Okay. All right. I want to begin by saying this is at least the third time I've been to Seton Hall over the years. I think Professor Frizzell, who I see in the back, will document that for you. I was telling some people at dinner that in 2001, we produced a film called I Am Joseph, Your Brother, and I was remembering now that we screened it here at Seton Hall many years ago and had a discussion about it. It was about, it took place after Pope John Paul II visited Israel, and a documentary filmmakers came to us and said, let's make a film about this visit and the history that led up to that, and we did it. And I wasn't supposed to talk about this tonight, but we did last year put it up on YouTube after having it as a what do you call those things? It used to be video, and then it was, what was that, the other thing we had?
MP3?
No, discs we used to have, right?
Oh, DVD.
DVDs we had. Now we don't have any of that. We just have Spotify and YouTube. So it's now free on YouTube. I Am Joseph, Your Brother, and it was one of the great moments of my life. And I was sitting remembering that we did screen it here shortly after it came out. And I spoke here several years ago with Professor Mohammed Dajani. Some of you may remember that. It was in a big auditorium. It was a nice event. So I'm happy to be home here. I feel at home. And I should add a personal note that I knew Sister Rose Thiering fairly well when I started my interreligious work in Jerusalem in 1991. She was running the National Leadership Conference for Israel and would come very often to Israel, and I would meet her there, and she would help me do things better than I did by myself. She was very good at being involved and caring very much about what we were doing. So I remember her fondly, and I'm happy to be here at the Sister Rose Thiering Endowment Fund on her Legacy Day. Okay, since I retired, which is now coming up in January, it'll be 8 years, I've devoted myself to writing and teaching. For 25 years, I was active in the field of interreligious dialogue and peace building through this organization that I founded with other people in Israel. And 7 years ago, I decided to sit down and start writing about everything I learned. So you won't get everything I learned tonight, but you'll get a few things. First thing I did is I edited a collection of essays of Christians, Jews, and Muslims who were active with me. And through a Catholic friend, Reverend Mike McGarry, who was the rector of the Tantur Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem for many years. He was chairman, or is chairman, I think, still of Stimulus Press and Paulus Press, if some of you know it. And we produced my first book of essays, which was called Coexistence and Reconciliation, Voices of Interreligious Dialogue in Israel. And those were essays by Jews, Christians, and Muslims who were active in the field at that time. That was 2015, I think. Then a few years later, I sat down and I wrote this other book, The Other Peace Process, where I kind of put down everything I learned about working in the field of dialogue in Israel and Palestine. And it was more of a kind of book for educators and people in the field, as well as a kind of personal memoir. And after I finished that, about 4 years ago, I had another idea, and I decided to write a book about not myself, but peace builders who are active in the field, and as one person asked me over dinner, are still active in the field of peace activism in Israel and Palestine, who are mostly unknown, unsung heroes in the Western world because they don't make the front pages of your newspapers. You know what makes the front pages, right? Okay, it's who killed who, or who was involved in the latest scandal. So these folks don't get involved in those things. And I decided to write a book about 6 people who are actively involved in dialogue and peace building and have been for many decades and do kind of a series of case studies, or I called it profiles. I'm also a child of the 60s, so I grew up with President Kennedy and his book Profiles in Courage. So I took the title Profiles in Peace, and I called it Voices of Peace Builders in the midst of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I want to tell you a little bit about, give you some background before I tell you about some of the people I wrote about. And I'm not going to talk all that long because I want to give you time to engage with me in questions and dialogue. I hope you will want to do that. So in the field of conflict resolution, which I've learned a little bit about in recent years, some scholars have talked about peacemaking versus peace building. Peacemaking is the term used for politicians, diplomats, international relations experts, lawyers, people who engage in making peace accords or peace treaties between governments. Okay, one of my friends called that pieces of paper. Now we don't even have that because they're only on the internet. Okay, peace treaties between governments, peace accords. Usually these peace accords are mediated by an American president or his staff or the Secretary of State. And in my part of the world, I've lived in Israel for 43 years, we have a series of peace agreements that were made. The first one, you may recall, was in 1979. President Jimmy Carter, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat came to what they called Camp David I, and they signed a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. If you know our history, we had 4 or 5 very bitter wars between Israel and Egypt. And a few years after the 1973 war, or what's called the October War, or the Yom Kippur War, the president of Egypt at the time, Anwar Sadat, decided to surprise Israelis and the world. And in 1977, he hopped over to Israel and made a visit to the parliament, the Knesset, and reached out to the Israelis and said, enough of war and bloodshed, and let's make a peace agreement. If you had asked people in Israel the month before, what were the chances of the president of Egypt hopping over to Israel to offer his hand in peace at the time, the answer would have been very small, if non-existent. But Sadat's famous gesture led to a dialogue between a right-wing Israeli leader, Menachem Begin at the time, from the right-wing party known as Likud, and to enter into a historic peace treaty with Egypt. Time goes by, and in 1991, under the Bush administration in this country, Bush and Baker, they came up with an idea of inviting Israeli and Palestinian leaders to an international peace conference in Madrid. And for the first time, Palestinians, as then part of the Jordanian delegation, engaged in peace talks with Israelis. The following year, Yitzhak Rabin was elected Prime Minister of Israel on a platform of entering into peace negotiations. And during his term in office, there were 10 months of secret negotiations in Norway, in and around Oslo. Many of you have probably heard of the play, the Oslo Diary, as Oslo Accords. I forget the exact name of the play, but this play, which was on Broadway and off Broadway for a while, documents this history. Negotiators from the Norwegian government brought together Israelis and Palestinians in secret, phony academic conferences in and around Oslo for 9 or 10 months. And after these meetings, they came up with an agreement through dialogue, or what I call schmoozing. Everybody know what schmoozing is? Okay. Right? They sat around the campfire, they had some beer, they didn't, enter into formal negotiations, and they built a lot of trust with each other, and they came up with a thing which is called the Declaration of Principles. And Bill Clinton, President Clinton, invited them over, and some of you will recall on September 13, 1993, there was a famous signing on the White House lawn with the iconic picture of President Clinton, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres on the other side, and they signed this historic treaty or accord called Oslo Accord or Oslo I. It was the first time that the Palestinians and the Israelis had seriously entered into any kind of negotiations. Before that time, our conflict used to be known as the Israeli-Arab conflict, but it became more known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the 90s. And this was followed by a series of accords, Oslo I and Oslo II. I like to remind people, and especially here at Seton Hall, 3 months after the signing of the Oslo Accords, on December 30th, 1993, there was an agreement called the Fundamental Agreement between the State of Israel and the Holy See. So the Vatican and Israel entered into very quick negotiations and very quickly reached an agreement in principle. I once gave a lecture to a group of rabbis, and one rabbi said, "It never happened." I said, "Well, I'll show you the picture where I'm standing in back of Yossi Beilin when they're signing the agreement in the foreign ministry." Yes, it happened. So the joke in Israel is that the state of Israel recognized the Vatican. Okay, and the Vatican recognized Israel, and we've had diplomatic diplomatic relations with the Vatican ever since, which is an important historical moment, I think, for us to mention. It was followed the next year by an agreement with Jordan, and the 90s was a period of great political progress. In 1998, under Clinton, we had the last agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It happened at a place called Y River, Aspen Y River Plantation outside of D.C. President Clinton invited Yasser Arafat. At that, we change prime ministers very often in Israel. I don't know if you follow our politics. So by that time, we had elected a young man named Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996. And Netanyahu had opposed the Oslo agreements in 92 and 93, but by the time he was elected in 93, Clinton and everybody else had convinced him get on board. And there are pictures, you can find them on the internet. He shook hands with Yasser Arafat and he came to Y River, and I have his pen. This is the pen he used. It's not really the pen, it's a joke. But I'm going to give him the pen when I get home to Israel and say, remember you once signed an agreement with the Palestinians back in 98? Maybe you can, take out your pen and do it again. So we had a lot of political agreements. Unfortunately, the one I just mentioned in 1998 was the last one we ever had, which means that for 24 years now, we have had no political progress between Israelis and the Palestinians. The only thing we've had are attempts at doing it, and they've all failed. And in recent years, there haven't been any attempts because both sides have kind of shelved it for their own reasons. And I'll have to be diplomatic here. Certain American administrations have not wanted to move forward on the Palestinian-Israeli track. They preferred other tracks. So at the moment, the political peace process, what you used to read about in your newspapers here, the peace process between the government of Israel and the Palestinian government is in the deep freeze. Okay? I wouldn't call it dead and buried, but it's in the freezer, kind of far back. Okay? At least, and it has been for a long time under various governments. So, what's left? And what's left is what the scholars in conflict resolution call peace building. Who are the peace builders? The peace builders are the rabbis, ministers, imams, educators, social workers, psychologists, all kinds of actors in civil society, what you call the NGO world in this country and other countries, whose job is not to redo the peace agreement that the politicians have already done, but to try to create peace between peoples. And that's not done through negotiation. It's not done with lawyers. It's done through dialogue and through educational methods, similar to the kinds of things you try to do here at Seton Hall through the Rose Thering Endowment. And if you were to come to Israel now, and Israel and Palestine, I could introduce you to tens of Palestinian and Israeli people and organizations who were working for peace that you never heard about. I remember talking about this once many years ago. I used to go to meetings of the community of St. Egidio, if any of you know that. It's a great Catholic community based in Rome. And I used to attend their meetings, and I was once in a meeting in a city in Europe, and I'm talking about this kind of work, and the Archbishop of Mozambique stood up, and he told me, I never heard of this. I never heard of anybody in Israel or Palestine who worked for peace. Meaning I never read it on any email, didn't see it on TV, didn't see it in my newspapers. I don't know a thing about it, what you're talking about. So the peace builders are people who are out there in grassroots groups, in individuals, in universities, in schools, in informal places, actively working to bring people into dialogue with one another, building relationships, creating trust, building peaceful relations between people from the ground up. And there are many such people and organizations in Israel and in Palestine, despite what you might read in your daily newspaper. Okay, so that's I'll call that a methodological introduction. So I'm here to talk to you about the peace builders. Tony asked me over dinner, am I going to talk about Israeli politics? Only if you ask about it, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. Okay. So I want to tell you about some of these peace builders who I've met and interviewed and wrote about, and my book is for sale, so I won't tell you the whole story because then you won't buy the book. All right. So one of my favorite people who on the Jewish side who I've known and respected for a long time is an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Michael Melchior. Rabbi Melchior is a modern Orthodox rabbi who grew up in Copenhagen in Denmark. His father was the chief rabbi of Copenhagen. His son, who grew up in Israel, is now the chief rabbi in the very same synagogue in Copenhagen. His other son, another son, is a rabbi in Norway, in Oslo, where his father also served. Came to Israel as a young man, studied in yeshiva in Jerusalem, As a student, was active in one of the local religious peace movements at the time called Nitivot Shalom, Pathways of Peace, and married, settled in Israel, served in Norway for a time, but spent most of his life, and he's still in Jerusalem now. He began meeting Palestinians in international meetings and in various off-the-record conferences throughout the 80s and 90s. And in 1999, he established a religious peace party, very unlike the current party that just got elected. It was called Meimad, the Religious Zionist Peace Party. And he went into the government with the Labor Party, Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and became a minister in the government, served in the government under Prime Minister Barak and afterwards Prime Minister Sharon, and was known to be a very active governor. He was involved in the negotiations at Camp David II, summer 2000. But after he left government, he founded a group of NGOs in Jerusalem, 5 different ones that would work in different fields. The one that I'm most closely associated with is called Mosaica. And within Mosaica, he and a number of colleagues established a program called the Religious Peace Initiative. Actually, in my first book of essays 7 years ago, he wrote a wonderful essay about this, but since then it's grown and developed in big ways. And Rabbi Melchior believes that creating a piece of the elites or a piece of the secular Tel Aviv intellectuals is not good enough when so many people in society in Palestine and in Israel are religious. And so he's been reaching out to religious Muslims, religious Jews, less so Christians, because that's not the main source of our problem in our area, and developing good relations between what you might call hardcore religious leaders who you wouldn't think would be interested in talking peace based on their own study of their own texts and their own religious values. And he does a lot of his work without fanfare and without publicity, often saving lives in ways that we don't hear about very much. And Rabbi Melchior is in the category of what I call a persistent peace builder. That means it's somebody who doesn't give up because a bad government gets elected this week or a bad president gets elected some year in a different country. But despite the ups and downs of the political movements within Israel and Palestine, continues to work every day in small or larger or significant ways in bringing people to learn to live to peace, because he has a religious faith and a vision of where he wants to get to that guides him every day in his work. So Rabbi Melchior is the first person I want to introduce you to. And in my many interviews with him for the book, he tells many great stories of how this movement for peace not only affected his life, but in his view is so central to what Judaism is really all about. On the Palestinian side, one of my heroes is a professor by the name of Muhammad Dajani. Some of you may recall that I was here with him several years ago. He was in a big auditorium here. We had a very significant platform together, and he and I have lectured together in the US and in Israel and other places. Professor Muhammad Dajani comes from a distinguished Jerusalem Muslim family. In fact, his full name is Muhammad Dajani Daoudi. Daoudi sounds like David, okay? So his family holds the keys to King David's tomb on Mount Zion. And they've been in Jerusalem for hundreds of years. grew up there, but as a young student in the 60s became a PLO activist and moved to Lebanon, studied at the American University in Beirut. Interestingly, he still posts a lot on Facebook, and he is always posting old photos, and there's a picture of him when he was a young rebel, you know, with a beard and looking very 60-ish, which he doesn't look like now, in his years in Beirut. After a few years doing that, he became disenchanted with the movement, moved to Jordan, then went to London, and eventually came to America. And he studied at University of South Carolina, and then at the University of Texas. He got 2 doctorates in government. And he came back to live in Jerusalem and established the first program on American studies at a university called Al-Quds University, which is one of 6 Palestinian universities in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And he ran that program for many years. He was also a librarian at the university. But he tells a very interesting story, actually 2, of how he got back to Jerusalem, because it wasn't so easy to re-enter. In 1995, he learned that his father was ill, and he arranged, because of that, to get a permit to come back to Israel. And when he came to Israel, he went with his father to visit Hadassah Hospital, a famous Israeli hospital in West Jerusalem. And he didn't know Jews in Israel until then. He grew up, shall we say, with a certain narrative about Jews and Israelis, that they were the enemy and they were just occupiers and oppressors, and he didn't know if they were human beings or not. And he goes with his father to the hospital in Hadassah Hospital in West Jerusalem, and he discovered that even though his father was Palestinian, he got perfectly good treatment, and he was treated as a real human being. And he, for some reason, this totally shocked him. And it helped transform him to see the enemy as a possible friend. The next year, his mother got sick. According to his story, they were on a visit to Tel Aviv. But his mother had asthma, and she didn't have her inhalator, and she couldn't breathe. So they stopped near the airport at a military checkpoint. And they were in a panic. They said to the soldiers, "What can we do? What can we do?" And they said, "We'll take you to the closest military hospital," which was 5 minutes away. And they took his mother there with them, and they helped her with her asthma. And again, he was transformed to see the human side of Israelis who he had grown up to view as the devil. So he becomes a peace builder, not only through his work in teaching at the university, but he founded an organization called Wasatiyah, which is Arabic for the middle way, or moderation, tolerance. And ever since then, he's been preaching and teaching in Jerusalem and around the world at conferences and on Facebook and on the internet, the doctrine of moderation in Islam. He also spent 10 years teaching this to Islamic clerics in Palestine, in Ramallah and other places. But now a lot of his work has been international as well. And he is one of the heroes and probably the leading Palestinian interreligious activist for peace that you can find in Israel and Palestine. He lives in East Jerusalem, and we actually meet each other often. I've been to his home, he's been to my home, and I've been to his offices. He's got beautiful offices with a tremendous library of thousands of books in the top floor of his home. And you can find him on the internet. He's all over the internet all the time, writing and teaching and YouTubes. And he did spend also a few years in Washington at one of the think tanks, I think it's called the Washington Institute, where he wrote about his views of Islam. So I like to mention Professor Dajani, not only because he became a good friend and colleague, because many people don't think there's such a thing as moderation in Islam. Okay? But he studied the sources. So he can give you a good lecture with lots of quotes proving his case. And he's done it many times. And maybe you could have him here to do that sometime. Okay. I want to say just a few words about some of the others, and then I want to come to some concluding thoughts and then open it up for your questions and some discussion. I wrote about 3 men and 3 women. One of the women on the Palestinian side I wrote about is a youngish woman in her 50s named Huda Abu Arqub. And what might be interesting to you is she has a lot of American experience too. And somebody pointed out to me after they read the book how many of the people were influenced by their experience in America. It's an interesting thing. So Huda Abu Arqub was born in Jerusalem, grew up in a village called Dura, near Hebron, in the southern part of the West Bank. She and her family experienced many different difficult years living under what they view as Israeli occupation of their lands. But she went to Al-Quds University, graduated in the early 90s, and I take you back to what I call the good old days of Oslo. So when the agreement was signed in 92, 93, the Palestinian Authority at the time believed in cooperation with Israel. And so they discovered this young woman who spoke English well, and she was a teacher, and she said, you speak English? We're going to start sending you to meetings with Israelis in Vienna and here and there and elsewhere. And she describes it in one of the interviews where she goes to Vienna and she meets Israelis for the first time, Israeli Jews I'm talking about. And she's completely blown away that they're human beings. She had, she never met and talked to anybody before except soldiers or settlers. And she begins to engage with them on not just meeting each other, but on educational issues and what can we do together and how can we work together when we get home. And then over time, she's invited to America. She spent 4 years in the Boston area, I think with Boston College and the Middle East Peace Summer Institute. She got a Fulbright scholarship and went to a university I had never heard of called Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia, where there was a famous scholar, John Paul Lederach, who was one of the great scholars of conflict resolution, then moved to Notre Dame and now recently retired. And she, during her 2 years there, wrote a master's thesis on Judaism, Islam, and Christianity on peace, studying the sources. And she comes back to her home for a while and then gets one more experience in America. And she is invited to San Francisco, where a Jewish fellow whose name is Tapper, not Jake, brother Aaron Tapper, who was a professor at the University of San Francisco, started an NGO program called Abraham's Vision, which had 2 tracks. One track was Jews and Muslims in America beginning to talk to one another, right? This is after 9/11 and, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim, Islamophobia, it's called here. And it had a second track of Palestinian students in American universities talking with Jewish students at American universities. Instead of shouting at each other, maybe dialoguing with one another and learning something about each other. And she did that for 6 or 7 years. Finally, she comes back to home, and she lands a job with a group called the Alliance for Middle East Peace. OLMIP, Alliance for Middle East Peace. I bet most of you have not heard of it. It's an organization started in Washington in 2004, and it's been around and it's grown and developed. It's an umbrella organization, you can look it up on the internet, Alliance for Middle East Peace, which lists on its website 160 organizations, Israeli, Palestinian, co-Israeli, Palestinian, international, working in a great variety of ways in education, in health, in advocacy, and water, and many different fields, all working in the field of peace building in Israel and in Palestine. It's a wonderful group of people. I've known it since the beginning. And she becomes the regional coordinator, I think it's the last 6 or 7 years, bringing groups of Palestinians and Israelis together, working on empowerment, working on what they call capacity building, how to make these organizations stronger, with help from foreign grants from many different countries. And she tells her story in the book. And I went to an event that a couple of years ago. It was in the middle of COVID when we had one of our gaps between waves, where we could leave our house. And I went to an event that was actually at the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. And she brought young Palestinian and Jewish storytellers to come and tell their stories about their work in peace building, which they had received a grant and they were trying to make publicity about it, so I wrote about it on my blog. And she was just full of energy and full of life and full of commitment to peace and reconciliation, despite how difficult it is on a daily basis, despite the ongoing challenges of blockades and curfews and checkpoints and you name it. She and many other people fit into my category of persistent peace builders. So Huda is one of my heroes. And I'm going to mention one more, and then I'll try to close with a few thoughts. I met in the last few years a woman named Hadassah Fruman, who lives in Tekoa, which is a settlement in 15 minutes south of Jerusalem, below Bethlehem in the desert. If you know the Bible, the prophet Amos hung out in Tekoa. Okay, it's a famous place. So she and her husband moved there in 1969, shortly after the Six-Day War, and were part of the settlement movement, Messianic Jewish settlement movement. But her former husband, who died about 8 years ago, Rabbi Menachem Fruman, became the leading Orthodox Jewish peace builder of his time and established relations with some of the religious leaders of the Hamas movement, which was completely off the charts when he did it, and actually helped Rabbi Melchior meet some of these folks over time. And he would go into Gaza and meet with the Sheikh Yassin and others because he believed in the power of reaching out to religious leaders who could affect change. After he died, his wife continued his legacy. We're talking about legacy tonight. And she's involved in a group of Palestinians and Jews who live in the area known as the Gush Etzion block just south of Bethlehem, who established a center called the Dignity Center, where they bring youth and women and children together to meet one another and learn about each other. And she's committed to this work and believes that somehow or other Palestinians and Jews can find a way to live together in the land that we all share. So there are many more of these people. You can read about a few of them in my book. In my next book, maybe I'll write about others. We'll see if I have energy. Now I want to say a few words towards the conclusion about a question you were going to ask me, because I'm asked this often. With everything going on, is peace still possible? Right? Or should we just give it up and take it out of the freezer and, put it into the grave? Okay. So you can probably guess my answer. I believe peace is still possible. I can't tell you when. I'm not a prophet in that way. But I want to make my case for you. Here's my case. I already mentioned, when Sadat came to Jerusalem in 1977 and said he wanted to make peace with Israel, did anybody believe that was possible? Nobody. when Nelson Mandela got out of jail in South Africa, did anybody who was reading the newspapers think he and de Klerk were going to get together and make end apartheid in South Africa? Nobody. Okay? Did anybody imagine that Yitzhak Rabin, who came out of a military background, you know, he was commander of the forces in the Six-Day War, spent his entire life in the military, was going to shake hands with arch-terrorist Yasser Arafat in 1993 in Oslo? Nobody. So I could give you many more examples, but peace can break out through different leaders in different circumstances at different times. And it has happened quite often already in recent history, okay? If we were talking a little bit about Catholic history, who believed that in 1962, right, the Catholics and the Jews were gonna, you know, engage in rapprochement? That wasn't exactly expected either. So many things have happened that are not talked about in our daily press. That's one point. And then I want to close with a story from that I encountered several years ago when I was asked by Luna Kaufman. You all know, some of you know Luna Kaufman, who's been very involved in this fund. So Luna Kaufman and I have known each other for 50 plus years when I was a young rabbi and worked in Plainfield for a year when I was a student, and she was the chairman of my committee. So I've known Luna for a long time. And several years ago, she lives now in Manhattan, as some of you know. She has a neighbor who belongs to St. Bart's Episcopal Cathedral on 50th Street and Park Avenue. You know, it is the Episcopal Cathedral in New York. And she takes me to meet the rector, and he says, I want to invite you to come on Sunday to do a rector's forum. We have these forums after Sunday morning worship. We go into a back room and we sit around and I'll interview you, and do you agree? I said, okay, fine. So I come a few weeks later, and I got there early, and the rector was standing in the back. The services had ended, and he was talking to one of his congregants saying, Shabbat Shalom, which he said in English, peace be unto you. We have the same thing in Hebrew, more or less. Okay? And he was talking to this fellow, and I went up and said hello. I said, oh, I'd like you to meet one of my congregants, a fellow named George Mitchell. Some people in the room will remember this name. Senator George Mitchell was the majority leader of the Senate, a well-known senator from Maine, Democratic senator for many years, a distinguished lawyer. And after he retired from politics, he became a lawyer in New York, and that's why he was in that church. And after I met him, he comes into the room, and I see him sitting in the back, so I'm a little nervous because he knows a few things about, you know, the Middle East peace process and other things. So we were talking about a problem which we had then and we still have now, and I call it political despair. What does that mean? That means that neither side of the conflict trusts its political leaders to get us out of the conflict. Okay? There's a lot of distrust of politicians. I don't know if you've ever heard of that in this country, but in our part of the world, you know, it's a pretty big thing. So we have political despair, and we're talking about that, and he raises his hand, and he says, Director, I'd like to make a comment. So, okay, George Mitchell, you know, what are you going to do? So Senator Mitchell stands up and he says, I have to tell you the following story, that in 1998, when I went for the last week of negotiations to Belfast, between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, who, as you know, had been killing each other for several decades. He arrived on a Monday morning, And the headline in the local newspaper said 84% of Protestants in Northern Ireland and 84% of Catholics in Northern Ireland say we will never have a peace agreement here because there's just too much hatred and too much blood, too much history. And 4 days later, on Friday, he pulled off what was known in history as the Good Friday Agreement. So that was Mitchell's story. I like to repeat his story because I don't go along with the people who say we'll never have a peace agreement because you never know when. And we've had many surprises, as I've already indicated to you. So my closing remark before we'll open to questions is that I believe never give up on the hope for peace. And one of the things that's, I think, a religious obligation and maybe a moral obligation is to keep that flicker of hope for peace alive. And I think the peace builders right now are doing it better than the politicians, at least in my part of the world. All right, I'm happy to entertain questions. Tell me.
Thanks very much, Rabbi, for your address. It was very interesting. I'm wondering if you could say something about the role of the Ecumenical Institute at Tantur in the peace process in that part of the world.
So the question was about the role of an institute in Jerusalem called the Tantur Ecumenical Institute, which is now part of Notre Dame University. As you may know, it's been renamed. Now it's part of the Gateway program, and it's undergone a sort of reorganization. But the Tantur Ecumenical Institute, first of all, personally, I've known it since the day I started working in interreligious relations. Father Tom Stransky, who maybe you knew, was a very close friend of mine and was the first co-chairman of my organization for the first few years. And I was honored to have him as a friend and colleague. And for those of you who don't know the name, he was one of the folks active in Vatican II and a serious thinker. And he spent many years at Tantur, as did Father Michael McGarry, who I mentioned is a Paulist father now up in Boston. So I've known Tantur for many years. The main purpose of Tantur is to host Christians for study in the Holy Land. Both scholars and students, so Notre Dame students go there all the time, and visiting scholars and visiting groups who will come and learn about the land, but they'll also learn Judaism and about Islam and about contemporary Israel. And they have very significant programs that's gone on there. But the interesting thing about it, it's located, have you been there? I figured as much. Okay, it's located on the southern edge of Jerusalem overlooking Bethlehem, and they have a room there called the Bethlehem Room, where if you go on the porch, you see Bethlehem. And because it's on the edge of Jerusalem to the West Bank, it's been an oasis of peace for many off-the-record informal dialogues between Israelis and Palestinians for many, many years. And that's not terribly well known or publicized. I don't think they publicize it in their PR materials. So I've been there many, many times, not only to deliver lectures, but to meet Palestinians there, because it used to be, before 2000, very easy for them to cross over. And even still today, it's a place where it's relatively easy to get to. So it's a wonderful, wonderful place, besides its formal curriculum, in terms of being a host for dialogues. But I could add, by the way, that they're not the only people. Many Christian institutions in Jerusalem do that. They're one of the best because they have the facilities and so on, but there are many others who quietly, behind closed doors, have been oases of peace where people can come and dialogue without fanfare, without press, without publicity, which is very important in building trust between Israelis and Palestinians. So Tantur, great place, and still playing a significant role in this thing to this day. They just celebrated some anniversary, I forget what, just a few weeks ago. Yeah, it's a wonderful place in Jerusalem.
So I can help answer a little bit of that question myself. I used to live there.
Oh.
Yeah, when I was 17.
Oh, okay.
So that was the inaugural year
Oh.
from 1972 to 73.
There you
Apparently Pope Paul VI dedicated that site during the 60s, and then they finally built it. It was behind a beautiful Crusader castle gate, and
Yes.
they kept that, and they
Yes.
built, these wonderful buildings in
Yes.
modern Arab stone. So it was just a wonderful place to live.
It's up on a hill.
Yes, and yes, Notre Dame was involved.
Contour means hill.
Right, exactly. And I remember I was working out for football. I used to sprint in the olive groves, getting ready to go back to high school in the United States. But what happened was a guy named Monsignor Mueller. He was the rector of the institute. I believe he was from Notre Dame, as well as a guy named Charlie Sheedy. I don't know if you remember that name. He was big. Another guy was Chrysostom Sephiros, to show you the ecumenical aspect, vice rector. Eventually, I think he became a bishop in the Greek Orthodox Church. He was big. He was a good friend of mine. We played ping pong all the time. And then they had Professor Van Almen, who lived right above us. But the big night that I recall was when they had not just the three sects of Christianity meeting, but they had Muslims and Jews come in on a big night, and they had dialogue about the hot topic of the day, which was overpopulation and contraception. And I'll never forget my father's reaction. He said that the Greek Orthodox Church seemed to be a little looser about it than the Catholic Church. So that was very interesting. But I have two observations about that I'd like to hear your reaction to. I used to go to St. George's School, which is a Palestinian school in Nablus Road.
Downtown East Jerusalem.
Right, and so right now it's under the Episcopal Diocese, which covers many countries,
Yes.
actually. So what
Bishop
happened was
Nahum.
I'm sorry?
Bishop Nahum is the
Right, and I just heard him speak, actually, at the Diocesan Convention in Riverside, California, which I didn't get a chance to talk to him, which drove me nuts. But anyhow, what happened was I used to ride my bike every day, and I also played basketball with my Arab friends. I learned a little Arabic. Unfortunately, I only remember the dirty words. But what happened was when I went back in 2001 to cover the terrorist attacks for my news organization, which was New York One News, Spectrum News. Well, now Spectrum News, used to be Time Warner Cable. I went back to look for all my friends. I even violated curfew in the old city, and I couldn't find them. None of the educated Palestinians stuck around. And that was a big problem. They go to the UK, and my best friend, Mustafa Awad, ended up in Atlanta, Georgia. He opened up a mechanics garage, brilliant mechanic. And that seems to be
Palestinian family.
that seems to be one of the problems. That educated Palestinians don't stick around. So what do you have left over? Hamas, Abbas? I mean, my impression is that's kind of a problem there. The other thing is, when I rode my bike back to Tantur after school, I passed the UN, the UN encampment.
Yes.
And that's one of the questions I had for you. I remember Father David Bossman, Father Leland White, my mother and I traveled down to Sharm el-Sheikh on a trip, and we were with two Israeli girls who were about to join the army for 20 months.
Yes.
And they called it UN. At first I was like, what? And that's
was the Hebrew,
and that's the UN.
initials.
Yeah. So my question for you, two questions were: have you observed that yourself? The educated Palestinians just kind of leaving, they go to university elsewhere and they stick, and what kind of role do you feel like the UN is playing or should be playing in this peace process?
We have a brain drain of educated Israelis as well as educated Palestinians who go abroad for lack of jobs in their fields. Both are small countries with small numbers of universities and small amounts of high-tech. Israel has more now than it used to be. So I don't know whether one is worse than the other. There is, I believe, still a Palestinian intellectual class in East Jerusalem and in Ramallah. But like other things, they seem to be losing their influence to the rural areas where there's more rebellion against them. And also, since you mentioned the Palestinian president, Mr. Abbas, who was elected for 4 years and has now done 17, so he's not all that popular, and there's a lot of rebellion against him and some corruption there and things like that. So things aren't so smooth over there in Palestinian politics, which is, makes things more complicated. And it's not just so simple that the boss can wave a magic stick and do whatever he wants. In terms of the UN, there was a time when, I think a long time ago, that you're referring to, that Israelis looked down upon the UN. But I think that's changed now. I think because of particularly less what goes on in Jerusalem and more what goes on in New York, they see that plays a crucial role not only in conflicts around the world, but in the whole, I don't know what you want to call it, propaganda war. It's important to have solid ambassadors to the UN. It's important to play ball with the UN. And I think it's changed to some degree. I would even say that in certain places it's become crucial. For example, the peacekeeping force in Lebanon has been very helpful in recent years, and even to this day. And so I think the attitude has gotten better in recent years. The UN does have a headquarters still in West Jerusalem, or actually it's on the edge, and they're doing good things there in Jerusalem. I happen to know that one of my daughters works for an NGO, and they get grants from people in the UN. So I think they're active now, and I think it's not the same as what you remember. It's improved. Oh, nice.
From your interviews of the different people, did you find a common theme or a common, I guess I could use the word theme, of what was lacking in that peace process? Of, like an element that was missing or something that maybe could be focused on? I mean, I know you mentioned a lack of communication, or, the papers, you mentioned, the drain. Was there any one theme, though, within those interviews, something that kept coming up?
Yeah, I would say there are two themes. One theme is what I alluded to with the Rabbi Melchior and some of the other folks that come out of the religious faith perspective, that they felt that the negotiators were too secular and ignored religion completely, and think that it had nothing to do with the problem or nothing to do with solving it. And they say, no, but that's not correct. We religious folks can have something to do with it. So that's one. But there's another one which I think is also interesting, and that is there was a critique of the Oslo peace processes as being a piece of the elites. And for example, one of the things it left out was the whole concept of peace education. The argument was, we'll deal with these immediate problems of now of making certain declarations, and later on, somewhere down the road, we'll get around to peace education. And the critique was, well, if you didn't re-educate the people and help build up their interest in peace, then you lost them. And that was the feeling when the first Intifada happened, the second Intifada uprisings happened, that the people weren't with you on either side. And so the rejectionists kind of overwhelmed the folks. So the lack of reaching to the grassroots early on, to educating them about the benefits of living in peace was missing. In fact, one of the people in the book is named Bishop Menib Yunan, who was the Lutheran bishop in Jerusalem for 20 years, and then became the first Palestinian to be the president of the World Lutheran Federation for 7 years, and spent a lot of time in America lecturing in Lutheran colleges. He was involved in a group called the Council of Religious Institutions of the Holy Land, meaning the chief rabbi's office, the chief, the head judge, Muslim judge, the heads of the churches. They all were trying to work together on things. And one year, this is fairly late, after 2000, way after Oslo, they had some connections, if you really want to know the truth, in Washington, D.C. And they got a grant of your U.S. state tax dollars from the State Department of something like $600,000 or $700,000. And they commissioned a bunch of scholars to do a study of the textbooks in Israel and Palestine and what they teach one another. See, now I told them they could have given me that money straight, and I would have saved them and told them the answer, which they found. You know the answer? You know the answer. Nothing. They don't teach anything about each other. They don't teach about each other's religion. They don't teach anything about each other's historical narrative. Nothing. So guess why they hated and vilified each other? Because they only learned their own narrative. Okay, so they produced the curriculum, and at first they were very proud of it. And so they go to the Minister of Education's office in Israel, and they say, "Here's our report." And the guy says, "You can't, say these two things are equal." And he just put it on the shelf, and the other guy put it on the shelf, and nothing came of it. So this was a missing link, and I think it's sad that the link was missing, because in the end of the process, I like to put it this way: when we have our final peace agreement one day, there's going to be an educational annex. You follow me? And in it, it's going to say, we cannot teach history the way we used to. Right? We cannot teach only our narrative. When I worked in the field of interfaith relations, one of the things I did was go to lots of international conferences in Europe. And right after the fall of communism, I went for my first conference in Warsaw, in Poland. I remember staying at a Catholic seminary in Poland. This is in like 92 or 93. Oh wait, go back a step. The year before that conference, I went to a conference in Eisenach, Germany, which was part of East Germany. And it was a small conference of the International Council of Christians and Jews. It was like a study workshop. And we were 1 hour from the concentration camp called Buchenwald, which is next door to Weimar. But these people, their idea of a conference was to lock you up for 3 days and not let you out anywhere. So 4 of us left one day, and we went to Buchenwald to see the concentration camp. And I remember that at the entrance there was like a visitor center that the East Germans had set up, Communist East Germans. And then there was a film, and it talked about Bolsheviks fighting, the fascists, and the fascists fighting the Bolsheviks. There was no mention of Jews, as if they weren't killed in Buchenwald. And I was quite surprised. And I was told, well, this was last year's film. Okay, the next year I'm in Warsaw. And after the conference in Warsaw, a bunch of us went to Auschwitz. And this was a year or two after the fall of communism. And we go to Auschwitz, and our guide for the day was a Polish Catholic law student who had just spent a month at Yad Vashem in Israel. The last year, he couldn't go to Israel. He just spent a month at Yad Vashem, that's our Holocaust Memorial Center and Education. And he gave us the real tour of Auschwitz. So I said, wow, 1 year, 2 years, the whole narrative could change in communist East Germany. So I tell you that little story because narratives can change and do change in historical circumstances. And in the end of the day, we're going to have to change the way we teach our history and what we teach about each other. That's got to be part of the peace process too.
You touched on this already. I was going to ask kind of a two-pronged question. What role does education play on the problem over there? and maybe solving it? And what role might poverty have on that situation over in the Middle East?
I don't always have good news for you. So education is not playing a very positive role right now, okay? Most of the education is one-dimensional. We teach our narrative, you teach your narrative. The only way you can learn the other person's narrative, you could have if you came to my center when I used to work, or other informal places, but by and large, neither school system is teaching it, and quite on purpose, they're not teaching it. Okay, so we need the peace agreement for them to change that. Poverty plays a very significant role, absolutely. There was talk over the years, there used to be talk, I don't know if there is anymore, that, some of you may remember the name Shimon Peres, who was the president of Israel. Before that, he was in the government many years. He used to talk about the Middle East as being a kind of European Union, and he stressed the need for economic cooperation in order to get the Palestinians out of poverty. Jordan is a very poor country, although it still maintains peace with Israel. So poverty plays a significant role. Disgruntled, poor, unemployed people too often find their way to terror. That's, I don't think you need a PhD in economics to figure that out, but some people haven't figured it out. So that's got to be part of the picture as well. I used to say there's two appendices to the peace agreement. One is E for education, the second one is E for economics. Okay? Without either one of those, long-term future for the peace agreement is not great. Okay? So yes, poverty is a significant issue. In Jerusalem, where I live, 40% of the city are Palestinian. Most are below the poverty line, and that doesn't make for happy people. So yeah, it's definitely something to be considered. And by the way, not just by Israel, but by what's called the international community, the EU, America. People are aware of that peace is going to cost a lot of money when it happens. I mentioned the Northern Ireland conflict. I spent several visits to Northern Ireland. I learned about that conflict. A lot of money was invested afterwards to create the peaceful relations that go on there now. It didn't happen just by signing a piece of paper.
Conflicts cost a lot too.
They cost more.
Yeah.
Conflict costs more. Yes.
I've been to Israel 4 times. And of course, as the priest leading the tour group, you can tell from my patch jacket. I was always amazed that when I went to the homes of people, my tour guides and my bus drivers liked my personality. Father, we put the old people to bed. You come home with us tonight. And I'd go home with them to their house to eat. Both Jewish homes and Arab homes that were Muslim and Arab Christian homes. The one trip I ate so much, I thought I had been breaking fast on Ramadan for the whole trip. But what I was always amazed at, the people who worked in the industry of making the tourists have a good experience. They always had better relationships with each other because it wasn't just that they learned their narrative or the other person's narrative. They realized that you can't survive without each other. The last trip to Israel was my best trip and my worst trip at the same time. We had the walls up. We had the border crossings. But what I really was amazed at was the amount the population had increased. With all the people who have fled to the United States, I could not figure out where all these people came to. Because I work with 4 Palestinian mosques here. I work with 4 or 5 different Christian groups that are from the Middle East. And I was just amazed, where did these people come from? I was touched by the younger people who maybe were more secular than they were religious, but understood that they needed each other. What do you do about the people who don't understand the need for the other?
Okay, well, first of all, before I answer that directly, I'll make a comment on your comment, and that is, there's an awful lot of unknown cooperation and coexistence that goes on that is not reported. I mentioned before the hospitals, right? I mean, I'm not just talking about doctors and medical staff, I'm talking about patients, you know. You go to any Israeli hospital, medical clinic, Palestinians, Jews sitting one next to the other, you wouldn't know there's a war out there, okay? And in tourism is one of the other areas where there's lots and lots of cooperation. And in many sectors of our society, there's a lot of day-to-day living together, at least in the work sphere, that goes pretty well, most of it. And the other thing is that home visits like you do can go a long way to really understanding the reality beyond, you know, the news headlines and seeing how people really live. I think the answer to what you do to get other people to realize that we need each other is a long-term process of education. And as you know, education is not just in the schools, it's on the streets, it's in the family, it's in the media, it's in many, many ways. One, I believe, as an educator, one has to see the long picture, okay? You know, if you're running a school, you got 12 years, not 2 years. If you're in the university, you're working for it. In other words, you try to see the long picture, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And there are many, many groups who are working outside the official systems, doing educational work and bringing people together. So it's outreach, and many ways of outreach, and the religious communities certainly have a role to play in that as well, and can probably do more and better than they're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kronish. That was wonderful, inspiring. I'm so glad you came all this way.
I only came from Riverdale, it's all right.
Riverdale?
Yeah. I
I'll
was in
drive
New
you
York.
home. Oh, Riverdale, New York.
Yeah.
I was going to say Riverdale's right below me. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm so glad that everybody came, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and got as much out of it as I did. We have a table back there with information. Yeah, oh, I'm coming, don't worry. I'm saving the best for last. I have a list from people. Alan, this is for you. There's a table back and back, and it has information about our fund on the back, and donor cards, and the scholarships that we give and so forth, and that I was so lucky to have. So please take some of that home. I would really appreciate it. Okay? Okay.
Send it back in.
And bring it back in and filled out. And even greater in the back, we can buy the book. And I didn't touch any of the books, although I wanted to, but I was looking at all the pictures. It looks fascinating. And that you mentioned Profiles in Courage. I was just giving a whole talk on that the other day. One of my favorite books of all time. So here we go. So if you'd like to purchase one, you're going to go outside in the back right here, and then come back in, and Rabbi Kronish will be sitting here, and he'll autograph it for you if you would like. Okay? So thank you so much. This has been a wonderful Legacy Day, and we take, I too knew Sister Rose and had that privilege. And her legacy, I hope, has continued on with me as a teacher and most importantly as a person. And I know you take a piece of her with you as well. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.